Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 11 of THE 515 Christian Faith and Theological Inquiry. In case you do not remember me, my name is Edward Solano. Throughout this semester, I've been working as a TA for Dr. Sweden, so I have been helping with checking some assignments every week for your class. Today, I will share about some things that you should remember and consider about Amos Young's piece, Reimagining the Doctrines. Young's chapter on reimagining the doctrines asks many relevant questions about our doctrinal presuppositions. One of the main questions is, how should our doctrines be revised in view of contemporary experiences? And one might even ask, when thinking about this question, should our doctrines be revised? Young approaches these questions by talking about the doctrines of creation and providence with the lens of a theology of disability. When he does this, he invites us, his readers, to reflect with him on how should Down syndrome inform these traditional doctrines. He's talking about the doctrines of creation and providence. He even asks, are our doctrines of creation and providence appropriate to faithfully inform the experience of someone who has a disability? Or do our doctrines just stay quiet when thinking about these cases? Young asks very profound questions about our doctrinal presuppositions and assumptions, and he helps us realize that some of our doctrines might be a little biased or incomplete. They might not reflect something that affects the fullness of the human experience. Instead, they might just reflect the experience of some. What he's basically trying to say with this is that if our doctrines are proven to be lacking, perhaps a reformulation of our doctrines is necessary. Young, while reflecting on creation and the doctrine of creation, says this about the doctrine of sin and the fall. What is needed is a reformulation of the doctrine of sin and the fall that can provide a more plausible and coherent account for experience of disability in our time. When he's thinking about these doctrines, he's basically saying, instead of simply blaming disabilities in sin and the fall, maybe we also need to reconsider what it means to be made in the image of God. You know, examining all of this and rethinking about doctrines is really crucial for the Christian practice. It can be even considered pneumatology, or if you will, you can call it a pneumatology and a pneumatological endeavor. It is the work of the Holy Spirit in and through the church, bringing forth God's newness into the issues of the present. The Spirit does this by empowering the church to rethink about its presuppositions, maybe even rethinking the possibilities of what current doctrines can be or can become, and how they can be a better representation of God in the present. When thinking about things like these, Jürgen Moltmann says this, and considering at this time, he was considering God's hope. But he says this: our theological concepts become not judgments which nail reality down to what it is, but anticipations which show reality, its prospects, and its future possibilities. Maybe instead of trying to nail doctrines down, what we might really want to do, instead of just saying a doctrine is like this and it has to stay like this, we might need to see how God has formulated and is reformulating and wanting to reformulate our doctrines. Maybe we need to understand how God is forming and reforming our beliefs to better represent God's own character. I think that it is possible that theologians were into something when they recognized the paradigm of the Reformed Church, when in Latin they came up with this phrase saying, Ecclesia reformata semper reformanda est. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't know Latin. And when I read Latin, I just read Latin as if I was reading it in Spanish, because Spanish is my first language. So I need a translation. So that phrase in the Latin would mean or can mean something like this: the church reformed, always reforming, or the church that has been reformed is always reforming. Doctrines are an interpretation, many times a pragmatic interpretation of the experience of God in our lives, and doctrines develop out of the theological understanding of God's action. And it is important to realize that an understanding of God can progress, it can change, and it can grow. Our understanding can be reformed in accordance to what is revealed to us about who God is in the present. And let me tell you something about this reformulation of doctrine and this idea. It happens quite often. Doctrines are reformulated quite often. A good example of how doctrine is rethought and reformed is found in the practical application of the Church of the Nazarene's doctrine of holiness, or what it means to be a holy people. In the most recent manual of the Church of the Nazarene, there is a section titled The Covenant of Christian Conduct. I mean, this title has been there for a few years already. But yeah, we have it in our manual right now, The Covenant of Christian Conduct. This section has some practical applications on the Church's doctrine of holiness. The interesting thing is that these applications have not always been the same. A lot of them have been added, a lot of them have changed. A lot of it has been in flux for about 100 years now, maybe a little more than 100 years. And because so much has changed, it is apparent to us that there has been a rethinking of what it means to be a holy people, in a very pragmatic way at least. An example of how the covenant of Christian conduct has changed can be seen with a statement on dancing. It is interesting to see that in the manual of 1956, there was no such a thing as a statement about dancing. It is like if dancing did not exist in 1956, and I'm sure that that is not right. I'm sure people were dancing back then also. But if we fast forward a few years to 1985, there was a statement about dancing, and it was a pretty strong statement. And the statement said this: we hold specifically that the following practices should be avoided. All forms of dancing is one of those practices. This statement said that no form of dancing was allowed. So at this point, with this statement, it seems that no form of dancing can represent God's attributes because Christians should not practice any form of dancing. It is as if all forms of dancing are unholy or were unholy. But look at this pragmatic interpretation of the doctrine of holiness. Look at how it just changed a little bit again. Now, if you look at the current manual in 2022, you can look it up online or you can buy a copy of the manual. The statement now says, we hold specifically that the following practices should be avoided. And then there's a list of practices and whatnot. But then it comes to the one on dancing and it says, all forms of dancing that detract from spiritual growth and break down proper moral inhibitions and reserve. The statement is now more nuanced. It has progressed, it has evolved, it has been reformed, and it is reformulated. And its reformulation shows something: that there are some forms of dancing that can be good representations of God's character. Some dancing might even be holy. The fluctuation with this part of the covenant of Christian conduct for the Church of the Nazarene is just an example of how the practical aspect of doctrine can change, progress, and be reformulated. The same thing can happen with the doctrine itself. And that is what Young is bringing to our attention. Maybe there are some doctrines that need to be rethought and reformulated so they can be more faithful to who God is. I think it is good for us to reflect about what Young is proposing. And as I close this video, I want to ask you, do you think that doctrines should be reformulated? I have briefly shown that it is not uncommon for doctrines to be reformulated. It's not really an uncommon practice. But the question is, should they be reformulated? And you might also want to think and ask yourself, what are some things to consider before reformulating a doctrine? And perhaps you might want to ask the question, is there a time when a doctrine should not be reformulated? Is there such a time? I don't know. What do you think? For right now, my time is up. So as I say goodbye to you all, I just want to remind you, reflect on this, take your time, think and pray through it all. And guys, just keep up the good work in your assignments throughout the week. God bless you all.